That fateful morning, as Evelyn Hargrove stepped proudly out of her gleaming black Bentley, she looked up at the rustic sign hanging over the door, Callaway Repair and Machining, and let out a soft laugh. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was just a gentle, slippery smirk that tumbled out from between her meticulously manicured lips without a single ounce of apology. The kind of laugh purposefully designed to be heard only by those standing closest to her. Her imposing entourage heard it. Her private driver heard it. The two directors flanking her heard it too, and they simultaneously turned their faces away because that was the standard, most appropriate reflex whenever their powerful CEO encountered something she deemed garbage, something beneath her status. The following content is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, events, or locations is purely coincidental. Thank you for choosing to listen. We hope you enjoy the story and have a pleasant experience. But that arrogant woman was completely oblivious to an earth-shattering truth. She did not know that the quiet, brooding man standing inside that shabby shop, the one silently wiping his grease-stained hands on a torn rag by a steel workbench, was the owner of 7 core technology patents. Patents that her company's 3 massive production lines were desperately suckling on and relying upon to operate every single day. She did not know that the dead silence of this tiny machine shop was not the silence of a man settling for petty ambitions. It was the terrifying, chilling silence of a man who had already mapped out in his head exactly what he was going to do next. Evelyn Hargrove had just single-handedly signed her own death warrant, making the single most expensive mistake of her entire business career. And, ironically, she was still smiling triumphantly as she walked through that door. Brew a cup of coffee, find a quiet spot, and listen to the very last minute. Because if you have ever been trampled or looked down upon by the world, this is exactly the story you need to hear. Every detail in this play was placed there for a reason. Mason's machine shop was squeezed onto the edge of an industrial park in a mid-sized city, a city that had been growing disastrously in all the wrong directions for the past 20 years. The workshop building was narrow and deep. The exterior paint had faded into a dreary gray, peeling off in patches, and the hand-lettered sign hanging over the entrance had rusted at the corners, making it look older and more dilapidated than its actual age. But stepping inside revealed an entirely different dimension. Every tool down to the smallest wrench hung neatly on a pegboard. They were outlined with faint marker to maintain their shapes, ensuring not a single item was ever hung on the wrong hook. The surfaces of the workbenches were completely bare and absolutely spotless, except for the active job currently being processed. The floor was swept immaculately every morning before the first customer appeared, even on days when he knew for certain no customer would visit. The extreme tidiness of this place spoke volumes about the character of the man maintaining it, even though rarely did any visitor linger long enough to read that silent message. Mason Callaway was 39 years old. He had been running this shop for just under 4 years, ever since the lease on a larger space had ended. He had decided to downsize quietly, without any announcement, because small was exactly what he truly needed right now. He had a little daughter named Bonnie, 6 years old, missing a front tooth. She possessed a fierce, stubborn loyalty to a stuffed bunny named Cotton, a bunny that was always privileged to sit proudly on the corner of Mason's workbench during the hours she was at school. Every morning, Mason dropped her off at the neighbor's house at 7:45 a.m. and picked her up at 5 p.m. In the hours between, he worked. What most of the surrounding neighbors didn't know, because Mason never told them and there were no certificates of merit hanging in the shop, was that he had dedicated 11 brilliant years of his youth as a lead systems engineer at Vantex Engineering Group, one of the most respected industrial automation giants on the East Coast. He had personally designed production line control systems for factories spanning across 7 states. He held 7 patents to his name, all related to precision automation and cascade failure prevention in heavy industrial machinery. 3 of those patents had been licensed to major manufacturers, and the royalty payments pouring into his account every quarter, while not making him a billionaire, were always steady and rock solid. Mason left Vantex not because he ran out of ideas, nor because he was forced out. He left because Claire, the wife he loved more than his own life, had suddenly passed away from a fast-moving illness when little Bonnie was just 18 months old. And in that house, someone had to stay behind. He made the choice to step back with the same unwavering, decisive determination he applied to everything in his life. He didn't cry on social media. He never mentioned his glorious past unless directly asked, and honestly, rarely did anyone care enough to ask. His closest friend, Adrian Cole, who had stuck by him since their freshman year of college and was now running a small investment fund across town, frequently brought it up. But Mason always used the same method to deflect, a slight turn of the head and his eyes glued back onto the mechanical part in his hands. Adrian was tactful enough to understand that the conversation would only happen when Mason was truly ready and could absolutely not be forced. The only thing keeping the name Mason barely alive in the underground industrial circle without needing a single line of advertising was his reputation, the guy who fixed what others gave up on. The rumors spread slowly but took deep root in the machinery world, from one plant manager to another, from this maintenance supervisor to that shift foreman. The rumor was extremely brief. If a machine stops working and no team of experts can bring it back to life, call the mechanic at Callaway Repair. He didn't do marketing. He had no website other than a single Yellow Pages listing showing just a phone number. He charged very fairly, and he never failed. Every night after Bonnie was sound asleep and the whole house sank into silence, Mason would sit at the kitchen dining table with a mug of black coffee, engrossed in reading the latest technical documents. He constantly updated his knowledge with an iron discipline, exactly the way he kept his toolbox organized. He wasn't waiting for anything, but he was always ready. The call that changed the trajectory of everything struck on a dreary gray Tuesday morning in early October. It didn't go directly to Mason. It went to the phone of Jason Merritt, the Chief Financial Officer, CFO of Hargrove Industrial, from the hands of the plant manager at Manufacturing Facility Number 2 at exactly 6:52 a.m. The message was extremely urgent and smelled of disaster. The primary CNC production line had died in the night. A cascade fault had spread and chewed through the entire control board. The whole system was completely frozen. The on-site technical team had been sweating bullets for 3 hours, but was still powerless to isolate the source of the failure. Hargrove Industrial was not a nameless company. They were the third largest precision metal components manufacturer in the northeastern United States, and Nightmare of Nightmares Facility Number 2 was currently running a life-or-death contract to supply components for a Department of Defense subcontractor, with the delivery deadline ticking down to exactly 48 hours. Jason Merritt frantically called 2 national maintenance contractors before 8 a.m., only to receive the same cruel answer from both. They could only dispatch a team to the site in 72 hours at the earliest. He called the original equipment manufacturer's OEM service line and was put on hold indefinitely. Left with no other choice, Jason swallowed hard and called CEO Evelyn Hargrove's direct line at 8:20 a.m. He reported the situation using guarded, carefully polished words of a man well-versed in the art of turning bad news into something as least disastrous as possible. Evelyn listened and threw back exactly 4 ice-cold words. "Fix it by noon," then hung up. Jason's fourth call was back to the plant manager who had just reported the news, a veteran named Walt Garber who had been running this facility for 22 years. Faced with the escalating hysteria and pressure of the CFO, Walt responded only with the calm, flat demeanor characteristic of Midwesterners. Walt said he knew a guy who might be able to help. He said he couldn't guarantee anything. He said this guy only ran a shabby little shop and might not even take the job. Jason yelled, telling him to just give him the damn number. Before hanging up, Walt added one more thing, that this particular mechanic had once diagnosed a cascade fault in under 4 minutes, an error that a team of internationally certified systems experts had spent 2 whole days misdiagnosing. Skeptical Jason Merritt jotted down the number and dialed. Mason picked up on the 3rd ring. He was already at his workbench. The call lasted a mere 4 minutes. Mason asked what generation the control board was, what the ambient temperature in the facility had been the previous night, and whether the error codes were displaying sequentially or simultaneously. Jason answered all 3. After the 3rd answer, Mason fell silent for a few seconds. It was the kind of silence born from internal data calculation at breakneck speed, not from weak hesitation. Then he said he would come. He asked for the address. He didn't mention his fee at all, and Jason, in his extreme panic, completely forgot to bring it up either. Mason hung up, placing the phone face down on the table. He began repacking his secondary tool bag with the methodical efficiency of someone who already knew exactly what kind of minefield he was walking into. He gently placed Cotton, the bunny, on the workbench so Bonnie could see it when she got home from school. He left a sticky note on the door. Then he climbed into his beat-up 11-year-old pickup truck, drove across the city, and arrived at Hargrove's facility number 2 at 9:40 a.m. The factory was incredibly imposing, spotlessly clean, and surrounded by a fleet of expensive late-model corporate vehicles, cars whose combined value could probably buy Mason's entire shop. A group of people was standing, waiting in the parking lot near the entrance when he pulled in. Among them, Evelyn Hargrove stood out in a charcoal-colored coat, a phone in one hand, the other hand raised to block the sun, squinting as she evaluated the dilapidated truck encroaching on her territory. Mason stepped out. He wore dark cargo pants, a gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, and scuffed suede boots. He slung his heavy tool bag over one shoulder. He scanned the building first, then turned his eyes to the group. Evelyn Hargrove looked at him with the trademark gaze of an arrogant elitist receiving a package that didn't meet her expectations. Her eyes paused for a beat, quickly recalibrated, and finally settled into a disguised contempt masked by fake politeness. Her assistant, Kara Whitfield, stood 2 steps behind her and didn't say a word. Mason nodded a polite greeting to the group. Not a single person bothered to nod back. He silently followed the manager, Walt Garber, inside. What unfolded over the next 2 hours and 20 minutes was witnessed only by old Walt and 2 floor technicians men who had been ordered to stand by just in case Mason needed someone to run errands. But he didn't need any help at all. He navigated through the control cabinets methodically. His movements were unhurried, but his focus was terrifyingly absolute. He didn't utter half a word except for a single instance when he asked for a specific diagnostic cable that Walt had to run and fetch from a side cabinet. He didn't open a single manual or guidebook. This truly amazed Walt because this entire system was a closed, proprietary configuration installed almost a decade ago. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the production line restarted. The machinery roared back to life. The cause of the incident: a secondary ground loop fault had masked a corrupted initialization sequence, an extremely fatal disease that the original equipment manufacturer's remote diagnostic systems would have certainly taken another 2 days to pinpoint accurately. Walt stood at the edge of the workshop floor, watching the first components flow smoothly down the conveyor belt, with the deep satisfaction of a man who had witnessed too many rotten things break in this building, and far too few truly right things happen. Mason packed up his tools. He walked out of the production area, down the main corridor to the exit, where Evelyn was waiting with CFO Jason Merritt and 2 other operations managers. She was typing on her phone again. When Mason appeared, she put her phone away and spoke with the cold efficiency of someone wanting to settle a bill to get rid of a delivery boy. "How much?" Mason gave her a number. It was an extremely fair rate, no extortionate markups, nor did he demean himself with a discount. Evelyn didn't even bother looking up at him as she ordered Jason to process the payment. At this point, Jason, with the smug face of a man who deluded himself into thinking he had successfully handled a trivial inconvenience, raised his voice, speaking loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "It's a good thing we found someone, and isn't it convenient that the rate of a small-time operation is so much easier on our quarterly budget than those big contract firms?" One manager smirked in agreement. The other looked down at his shoes. Jason kept blabbering on. He rambled about the art of operating cost management, and that derogatory phrase, small-time operation, was chewed over twice by him in just 30 seconds. Every time it left his mouth, he deliberately emphasized the tone to detach it from a normal description, turning it into a sharp, sarcastic blade. Evelyn didn't stop him at all. She was already glued back to her phone screen. Standing right behind Evelyn assistant Kara cast her gaze toward the distant wall with a careful emptiness. Mason recognized that expression. It was the look of someone feeling profound embarrassment at what they were witnessing, yet lacking the authority to intervene. Mason didn't bother responding to Jason. He didn't look at Evelyn for a reaction either. He zipped his tool bag closed slowly, calmly, exactly the way he had opened it, and slung the strap over his shoulder. Evelyn glanced up for a brief moment, dropping a final remark that she considered a graceful bestowal of favor. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. If we have smaller issues in the future, we'll be in touch." The word "smaller" plummeted into the middle of the room, settling there with bitter harshness. Mason looked her straight in the eyes, for the first time that day. And on his face, at that moment, there was absolutely nothing she could grasp to satisfy her ego. No hurt, no outrage, and no plea for validation. He looked at her exactly how he looked at a machine he was studying, reading all of its flawed characteristics but not bothering to judge. He replied softly, "No problem," then turned on his heel and walked out the door. Walt Garber rushed after him all the way to the exit. The old manager held out both hands, gripping Mason's tightly, his voice dropping with emotion. He recounted that the control system Mason had just saved was actually designed by a team of geniuses from Vantex about 9 years ago. He said he was there when it was installed, and he had never seen anyone outside that original team touch it without needing a manual. He said he didn't know if Mason had studied this system from somewhere, but no matter what, he owed him a great debt of gratitude. Mason thanked him without explaining another word. He walked out to the parking lot. He sat quietly behind the wheel of the truck for a long time without turning the ignition key. Through the windshield, he stared at the spotless industrial facade of the building, where a brushed steel plaque engraved with the word Hargrove was mounted right next to the entrance. His face didn't change color. His hands were motionless. Then he reached over and opened the center console, pulling out a pale yellow file folder that he hadn't touched in over 2 years. Inside was a document from his time at Vantex, a consulting report he had been hired to write about the rehabilitation potential of an old facility owned by Hargrove. He stared at the cover page for a moment. Then he put the folder back, started the engine, and drove off to pick up his daughter, Bonnie. Adrian dropped by Mason's house that evening carrying a 6-pack of beer and no specific agenda. It was Adrian's way of silently signaling that he knew something had happened, and he was always ready to listen if Mason wanted to open up. They sat at the kitchen table after Bonnie was fast asleep. Mason recounted the entire day's events objectively, without adding emotional fluff. From the call, the repair process, the payment, to Jason Merritt's mocking remarks. Adrian listened to it all, then asked the question he had been brewing since Mason's first sentence. "What are you plotting?" Mason looked up. "I'm thinking about the Westbrook facility." Adrian gently set his beer bottle down on the table. The Westbrook facility was the third manufacturing plant in Hargrove's asset portfolio. A real estate property that Evelyn Hargrove had ruthlessly shut down 14 months ago, citing operational inefficiency. It sat on a 12-acre plot in the Westbrook neighborhood, about 6 miles from where they were currently sitting. The machinery inside was old. The building had an outdated industrial architecture. This entire property had been hung with a for sale sign for 9 grueling months without a single ghost showing interest because it carried the reputation of being a money-burning black hole. Adrian knew these details inside and out because Mason had casually mentioned it a few months ago in a context that didn't seem very important at the time. But now, hearing Mason grit his teeth as he pronounced that name, Adrian instantly realized. As it turned out, it had always been an extremely crucial chess piece. What Adrian didn't know in that moment, the thing Mason spent the next entire hour dissecting, was the massive core of truth existing inside Westbrook, and the reason why all the investors' disparaging remarks about it were absolute garbage. 5 years ago, during his golden era as a consultant, Mason had stepped foot inside that facility. Hargrove's old management team, pre-Evelyn era, had hired him to do a rehabilitation assessment study. He had embedded himself there for 3 days with a small team of technicians and personally penned a report detailed down to the millimeter. His conclusion: 70% of the equipment installed there was perfectly salvageable and recoverable if investments were made at the right points, and if systematically upgraded, its production capacity would crush both of Hargrove's currently operating facilities at a shockingly lower cost per unit. That report was submitted, received, and as Mason later found out, Evelyn had forwarded it to CFO Jason Merritt to handle, but it was never executed. The factory was mercilessly shut down. Instead of reviving it, they tossed his report into a dead drawer. Mason knew this well because he had followed up once out of professional courtesy, only to receive an automated template reply. He never asked again. But he never forgot what his eyes had seen inside that building. He never forgot the specific equipment configurations, the infrastructure layout, or the extraordinary potential that could be awakened. If someone who truly understood the core systems was willing to roll up their sleeves and do the engineering work. Someone who, coincidentally, was the very person who had designed many of the control systems perfectly compatible with that pile of equipment. Someone holding the core patents in his hands. Adrian asked exactly one question: how long? 18 months from acquisition to the first batch, Mason replied. Adrian sat in silence. It was the posture of an old financial wolf calculating numbers in the ledger of his internal convictions. Then he said, "I'm in." He didn't ask about the projected profit margins. He didn't ask about the risks. He only asked when Mason wanted to start the legal paperwork. Mason replied, "Tomorrow." Their legal representative was David Keene, a calm property law expert. His office always carried the faint scent of old paper. He had handled patent agreements for Mason during his Vantex years. The next morning, upon receiving the call from Mason, he welcomed it with cautious surprise. Mason requested an inquiry into the current ownership status and listing terms for the Westbrook facility. David said he would investigate and call back before the end of the workday. Just 4 hours later, he called back. The asking price was lower than Mason had estimated, not drastically lower, but low enough that the number felt like a door being held wide open, inviting him in. This real estate had been frozen for so long that Hargrove's board of directors had clearly given Jason Merritt the green light to accept any reasonably sounding offer, rather than continuing to carry this damn liability on the balance sheet, a report that was facing intense scrutiny ahead of the annual audit. David reported that there was no sign the seller was scrutinizing the buyer's background, aside from standard financial proof requirements. Mason ordered, "Draft the offer immediately." That night, he sat pondering the numbers. He reran the estimate spreadsheet 3 times, not because he doubted his own engineering skills, but because his life-or-death discipline demanded it. The capital Adrian pumped in was just barely enough to cover the acquisition fee, initial rehabilitation costs, and maintain operating cash flow for exactly 14 months before the first revenue stream flowed in. Extremely risky, but not impossible. Throughout his career, Mason was used to working with tolerance limits far more suffocating than this, and the principle remained constant. Precision mattered more than safety margins, and patience mattered more than speed. He drove to Westbrook on a Thursday afternoon while Bonnie was at school. The drizzling rain turned the vintage building's exterior brick walls into a blood-red rust color. The facility had been securely locked and shrouded in darkness for over a year. The loading bay doors were chained with rusty padlocks, but Mason had gained temporary access through David's office. He walked through the entire floor space over the course of 4 hours. He moved through each section with the quiet focus of a man reading a book written in a language he knew down to his marrow. He checked structural supports, examined motor housings, evaluated conduit runs, and tested the manual override buttons on the remaining machines. He didn't need to take notes. He didn't need pen and paper. All the data he needed was automatically encoded and neatly organized in his brain, the way great minds permanently categorize things they have decided to pour their hearts into. By the time he stepped back out into the rain, he confidently adjusted his 18-month estimate down to 15 months. This building had aged surprisingly well in the critical areas and had only deteriorated in places that were completely correctable. The acquisition deal was closed on a quiet Friday morning. No press release, no celebratory trumpets. The legal entity making the purchase was Callaway Industrial LLC, a company registered a mere 3 weeks prior with Adrian as co-owner and Mason as chief executive officer. The bill of sale was a public document searchable by anyone. But alas, not a single person working at Hargrove Industrial had any reason to idly search for it. And the name Callaway, appearing faintly in a routine commercial real estate transaction, raised no red flags. Jason Merritt casually scribbled his signature on the stack of transfer documents during a meeting he had scheduled for a mere 30 minutes, most of which he spent scrolling through his phone. The former Hargrove employees, those thrown out on the streets when Westbrook closed, were not informed of the sale. However, a few of them would soon find out through underground channels that didn't require official paperwork. In the weeks following the acquisition, Mason quietly began recruiting. He navigated through the network of the old manager Walt Garber and through old brothers-in-arms at Vantex to hunt down individuals possessing the specific skills the Westbrook factory craved. He didn't post flashy job ads online. He called them directly, presented the plan nakedly, and offered a fair wage, not glamorous, but solid. What truly drew these people here wasn't the money. It was the nature of the invitation. An opportunity to build an empire from the ashes with their own hands, led by a commander who understood down to the roots exactly what he was building and knew exactly why it had to be built. Among the first 15 recruits, 6 were former Westbrook employees, people Evelyn had fired without mercy. They knew this building well. They knew every machine by heart. On the first day of rolling up their sleeves to clean the interior, they showed up with a fiery vitality that Mason instantly recognized and deeply appreciated. He didn't stand on a podium to give a rousing speech. He just showed them what they were going to create together, frankly, answered all their questions, and then they got to work. There was a profound, thrilling satisfaction in his chest watching those 6 people confidently walk back through the very door that had once ruthlessly slammed in their faces. They carried their tool bags, wore the exact same old safety boots, bringing no bitter resentment, but rather the fiery determination of workers who profoundly understood the value of the opportunity just handed back to them. Mason noted that satisfaction, then coldly set it aside. There was too much work to do, and his mind had no empty space for sentimental feelings. While Mason was quietly building his kingdom in the shadows, Hargrove Industrial began entering a crisis period of accumulating friction, which its upper management was too foolish to diagnose in time. A defense subcontract, one presumed to auto-renew, was suddenly rejected. The contracting agency cited a cold reason, severe concerns regarding delivery reliability, highlighted in red in their evaluation files. Another loyal client also quietly reduced their order volume without bothering to offer an explanation. Evelyn received these warning signals through Jason Merritt's reports, and naturally, this CFO always knew how to mold those disastrous failures into local market fluctuations, covering up the systemic errors that were rotting day by day. Quality control issues, the root cause of customer dissatisfaction, had been smoldering across all of Hargrove's lines for nearly 2 years. It was the bloody consequence of slashing maintenance budgets and mass layoffs following Evelyn's restructuring campaign. That campaign had painted short-term profit margins pink, but plunged a fatal knife into long-term core capabilities. A cheap trade-off that any seasoned operations expert could see through instantly. Evelyn was a master of capital strategy and market brand positioning, but she was utterly blind when it came to the core mechanical foundation of production quality on the shop floor. Worse yet, the people around her, those who truly understood those mechanical principles, had all been filtered and kicked out through performance reviews. Blind reviews that only glorified those good at juggling financial numbers instead of valuing practical operations minds. Kara Whitfield was one of the few who realized the ship was sinking long before the water breached the deck. Serving as Evelyn's executive assistant for 4 years, she held the access key to all correspondence streams, meeting summaries, and direct customer feedback. She saw the full bleeding picture, not the flattering, polished version submitted up the hierarchy. 9 months ago, Kara had carefully drafted a memo exposing the terrible pattern she was seeing in customer feedback and the spike in maintenance requests. Evelyn read it, marked it, and casually forwarded it to Jason with an order to review. Kara never received a response. She was never invited into the room to discuss it further either. She had to stay silent, continue doing her job, and keep her eyes wide open to observe. It was during this period of observation that she first saw the name Callaway Industrial flash by in a transaction summary she was processing as part of her daily paperwork. At the time, that name evoked no concept. She filed it away and ignored it. Over at Westbrook, Callaway Industrial's campaign reached a milestone Mason called first production batch. The assembly line ran smoothly, achieving sustainable volume exactly in the 14th month since the acquisition. That was exactly 1 month ahead of his schedule. Their debut product was a portfolio of precision-machined aerospace components requiring tolerances so strict that only a handful of manufacturers across North America could consistently meet them. Mason had personally designed this production process to crush all those standards. He utilized an integrated control system reflecting the perfect combination of his genius engineering knowledge and the hidden potential of the equipment at Westbrook Machines he had personally upgraded and fine-tuned. The tolerance margin on the first production run was 15% tighter than the highest standard in the entire industry. Adrian, who was present there for the entire first shift, stood frozen for a long time after reading the quality report. Then he turned and said, "We're going to be drowning in so many orders, we won't be able to schedule them all in the next 6 months." Mason just replied succinctly, "I know." The first commercial contract flew in from a mid-tier defense subcontractor. 14 months ago, they had been one of Hargrove Industrial's VIP clients. They had dusted off their coats and abandoned Hargrove after a delivery disaster and had to grit their teeth working with a lesser supplier during the interim, while secretly scouring the market hunting for a worthy partner. Through an underground internal connection, they received a brief technical summary about Callaway Industrial. They ordered a small evaluation batch, and they received it right on the promised date, accompanied by a set of quality certification documents that far exceeded their own strictest standards. The following week, they immediately sent a formal contract request. Mason's legal team skimmed it, adjusted exactly 2 minor clauses, signed it, and sent it back. This partnership was not announced loudly. In the world of precision manufacturing, vital business deals were always kept strictly confidential. By the 16th month, Callaway Industrial had 3 production contracts running at full capacity and was sitting at the negotiation table for a 4th contract with a formidable Japanese automotive supplier. They had scoured North America, searching for a partner capable of meeting their insanely strict dimensional accuracy standards. The negotiation with the Japanese was initiated through an intermediary and conducted with carefully measured patience from both sides who both knew well a perfect agreement was something well worth waiting for. When the official contract was signed, its total annual value was larger than Hargrove Industrial's entire revenue from the previous quarter combined. This earth-shattering news appeared in merely a tiny paragraph in a specialized trade publication. It mentioned the name Callaway Industrial and called it an emerging precision components manufacturer based in Westbrook. There was no photo of Mason Callaway, no sensational startup story about the company's founding. Just the name, location, and the cold statistics. Sitting at his luxurious desk, Jason Merritt read that paragraph and suddenly felt the temperature in the room plummet below zero. A bone-chilling cold that had absolutely nothing to do with the air conditioning system. He dove into the search system, looking up Callaway Industrial, LLC's transactions, and dug out the property records regarding the Westbrook acquisition. He sat dead silent with that stack of files for a long time. He manually recalculated Westbrook's current production capacity based on the equipment he knew was left there and logical projections of what an outstanding operator could do if they pumped in investments correctly. The result of that calculation struck his chest like a 1,000-pound boulder. The price at which he had agreed to sell off that real estate cheap, the price he had been authorized to close on, yes, but also the price he had advised the board of directors was reasonable, was now worth only a tiny fraction compared to the massive profit stream that asset was generating every single day. He closed his web browser and absolutely did not dare open it again for the rest of that day. He decided to bury this matter, never letting it reach Evelyn's ears. But Kara Whitfield, working separately and 10,000 times more carefully, had traced that exact same trail and arrived at an entirely different horizon. She searched the name Callaway Industrial tied to the Westbrook facility and the known transaction date. She dug up the public records, and the name Mason Callaway sat proudly in the chief executive officer position. She froze for a moment, then typed his name into a new search window, adding the keyword Vantex. The results that came back were not surprising in the way new information is. It was shocking in the way an obvious truth you should have realized a long time ago hits you, a delayed jolt of realization. 7 patents. 11 years as a lead systems engineer at a corporation where, among their countless clients, was the name Hargrove Industrial. She printed out all those fatal document pages, carefully stapled them to the Westbrook transaction file, and shoved them into a folder on her desk. She sat staring intently at that folder for a while, then picked up a pen, meticulously writing the name Mason Callaway on the label edge in neat, unhurried handwriting. She didn't take it to Jason. With the clarity forged through 4 years of working there, she knew all too well the fate of information forced to pass through Jason's gate before reaching Evelyn. This folder absolutely had to take a different path. She patiently waited for the most perfect moment to bring it directly in front of Evelyn. That moment came on a late Thursday evening. The two women were hunched over, working overtime, as was customary at the end of the quarter. Evelyn was burying her nose in a pile of reports at the long table in the conference room. Kara was handling correspondence nearby. Kara quietly walked over, placing the folder on the table right next to Evelyn's water glass without uttering a word of explanation. Evelyn glanced at her, then looked down at the folder and slowly opened it. She read the first page slowly, then the second page, then the list of patents. She flipped back to the photo printed on the first page, a professional profile picture extracted from Vantex, taken 6 years ago. In the photo was a man wearing a dark jacket, looking straight into the camera lens, with a calm, unguarded expression of someone who felt no need to put on an act to prove anything. Evelyn recognized that face. She recognized that stature. She recognized exactly that terrifying stillness. It was the brooding man who had walked into her factory carrying a worn-out tool bag. The man who had used his bare hands to restart a production line that all the experts had declared dead. The man she had sarcastically thrown a cheap thank you at for solving a minor issue. She slammed the folder shut, her entire body stiffening for a moment. Then she looked up, her voice sharp and cold, asking Kara how long ago the Westbrook acquisition deal had closed. Kara answered clearly. Evelyn didn't open her mouth to say another word for the rest of that evening. The subsequent audit was a ruthless decision by Evelyn, launched without any warning, cloaked as a routine operational review submitted to the board of directors. Kara was assigned to support the audit team, meaning she had full access to the entire document trail surrounding Jason Merritt's management of the Westbrook liquidation process, and that trail stank to high heaven. The real estate valuation Jason had accepted and submitted to the board had absolutely no backing from any independent assessment. The risk warnings in the due diligence files were so sketchy it was obvious they had never been taken seriously. And there was a fatal section in the file regarding the buyer's background, where the verification information part was left completely blank. It was a blatant procedural violation, covered up by a deception in reporting. And the crime of deception was 100 times more despicable than the procedural violation because it was continuous and calculated. The audit team slammed their conclusion report on the table. A thorough report and the naked truth left no room for ambiguity. Jason Merritt gritted his teeth and submitted his resignation letter exactly 4 days before that report was officially read in front of the board of directors. He quit sneakily via email, clinging to the cliché excuse of wanting to pursue new opportunities. Evelyn approved it without bothering to type a single word of reply. After the final board member left the conference room, Evelyn sat alone. The window on the far wall looked straight west toward Westbrook, although from this distance one couldn't possibly see the building. She pulled the folder Kara had given her out of her briefcase, throwing it onto the table once again. She had tortured herself by reading it over and over 3 more times since that Thursday night. Not because she wanted to find new information, but because she was having to do something 10,000 times more bitter. Rewriting the entire garbage story she had deluded herself into believing about that mechanic. The guy she had laughed at contemptuously, standing in front of his shop. The guy she had tossed payment to without bothering to look up. The guy whose competence she had trampled with the word minor, tossing him straight into the past. Until a trade article slapped her right in the face, forcing her to wake up. She managed to get Mason Callaway's phone number through David Keene's office. This took exactly one phone call and no effort at all, because Mason never intended to hide. He simply had never been asked. He picked up on the second ring. She stated her name. A brief pause passed. It wasn't awkwardness, but authenticity, the pause of a person pondering how to respond, not whether to respond or not. He replied, "Hello?" She said she wanted to arrange a meeting to discuss a potential supply agreement. He said he was free on Tuesday morning. She asked what location was convenient for him. He replied, "At the shop on Callaway." She said she would be there at 9 a.m. Evelyn drove there alone. No assistant, no chauffeur, no stack of intimidating documents tucked under her arm. She had never truly set foot inside his shop. On that first day, she only stood outside the door, smirked, and left. But today, stepping inside, she looked at it with entirely different eyes. The neatly arranged tools, the spotless workbenches, and the framed photo hanging solemnly on the back wall. An elite team of engineers posing in front of a massive, newly completed production facility. In the photo, Mason was about a decade younger, standing second from the left. And right on the corner of the main workbench was a tiny white stuffed bunny with button eyes, one ear more frayed than the other. She looked at it for a while, then quickly turned her face away. There was something dizzying about standing in this room after standing arrogantly in her high-rise offices for so long. Something about the scale and physical authenticity of this space made the polished, hollow language she usually used to dominate others suddenly seem ridiculous and out of place. Mason walked out from the back door with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He placed one down in front of her without bothering to ask if she wanted it, then sat on the stool on the other side of the table. She wrapped her arms around the warm mug, getting straight to the point. She had thoroughly investigated his background, realized who she was dealing with, and wanted to discuss a long-term precision component supply agreement. Mason sat silently listening to her present the entire plan. Then he said he appreciated her directness, and after that he added one more sentence. Not a bitter reprimand, not an accusation, but just a naked statement. "Do you remember that afternoon at facility number 2? Evelyn looked at him. He said he didn't need any damn apology or compensation from her about that. He said what happened that day was what it was, and he hadn't lost any sleep over it. But he wanted her to engrave one thing in her mind. This shop is real, the work here is real, and he had never, not even for a second, felt ashamed of anything about this place. She looked straight into his eyes, not avoiding his gaze, and didn't offer a cheap, easy apology to end the conversation quickly. "I understand that now," she replied in a low voice. It wasn't exactly an apology, and they both knew it, but it was something far more concrete and valuable than an apology. A genuine acknowledgement spoken directly to the face of the person who deserved to hear it. She pushed a folder across the table. He looked at the cover, not bothering to open it. She said, "Take as much time as you want to review the terms." He nodded. She stood up, preparing to leave, reaching for her coat draped over the second stool. Standing at the doorway, she glanced back, looking up at the sign hanging over the door. The hand-lettered name rusted at the corners, the very thing she had once mockingly laughed at with a volume deliberately meant for others to hear. Today, she didn't laugh anymore. She read it as a line of information, bare and precise. The name of a man and the place where he worked. Nothing more, nothing less. That evening, Adrian dropped by the shop and saw Mason sitting at the table, the folder wide open, carefully reading through every clause of the supply agreement with the meticulousness he always reserved for decisive documents. Adrian set his coffee cup down on the edge of the table right next to Cotton the bunny and asked what he was looking at. Mason replied, "Hargrove wants to sign a supply contract." Adrian fell silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Are you going to sign it?" Mason said he was considering it. Adrian said, "3 months ago, if you had said that, it would have sounded very weird." Mason turned the page of the file and replied, "3 months ago, I wasn't ready to ask whether she was worthy or not, but now I am ready. That is the difference." Adrian raised his coffee cup to drink, saying no more words. That was his way of tacitly confirming that he completely understood that core difference. 3 weeks later, Mason put pen to paper and signed the agreement, not because he craved that contract. Callaway Industrial had more than enough resources to sustain itself and grow on its own terms. He signed it because the terms were extremely fair. The products would be used for the right purposes, and because, as he told attorney David Keene when they reviewed the final contract, good creations should be delivered to where they can maximize their value. David looked up at him over his reading glasses, clicking his tongue, saying that was quite an odd reason for a life-or-death business decision. Mason just smiled faintly, replying that he had made many odd decisions before, and most of them had yielded brilliant results. The shop's old sign was taken down on a Saturday morning. Mason himself climbed up the ladder with a socket wrench set, unscrewing every rusty bolt to remove the old frame from the board. Down below, little Bonnie was wearing her coat, hugging Cotton the bunny tightly, craning her neck to watch her dad work. When the old sign was taken down, the girl asked what words the new sign would say. Mason climbed down, stood next to his daughter, looking up at the blank, clean brick space where the old sign used to hang. "Just Callaway, sweetie," he replied softly. Bonnie thought about that for a moment, then nodded with a seriousness that 6-year-olds often reserve for momentous decisions they are allowed to participate in. The new sign was hung up that afternoon. Clean, flat, and minimalist, just one word printed in dark letters. No descriptions, no flowery advertising slogans. The name itself was a solid guarantee. It was just... The world took a bit too long to read it correctly. In a city where people live rushed, hurried lives and often judge each other by appearances, Mason Callaway's story wasn't one to be broadcasted loudly. No flattering articles, no polished portrait photos, no sensational startup stories remixed on internet forums. Trade magazines occasionally mentioned the name Callaway Industrial when a contract was large enough to draw attention. The number of people who knew the ins and outs of this spectacular overthrow story could probably be counted on one hand, enough to fit inside the shop's tiny reception room. But in the underground world, where precision patience and silent dedication dictate longevity, Mason Callaway had built an empire. An empire that would continue to run smoothly and powerfully long after the names printed on Hargrove's letterheads had been changed and forgotten many times over. He accomplished that without needing a single loud declaration, and absolutely not out of hatred or revenge. Because hatred is never a tool a true engineer uses to forge great things. He did it exactly the way he healed the machine on that fateful day, silently, precisely, and perfectly, to the very end. And when the work was done, he turned off the lights and went home to his little daughter.